Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about how to make a podcast site in Statamic. And what we're going to do is we're going to make one from scratch. For the main written article, I'm just going to write down the specific RSS feed things that you'll need for the podcast. But I thought it would just be, I'm not sure fun is the right word, but it would be more thorough to create it from scratch for the video. So before I get going, I assume that you've at least got a Statamic site up and running. If you haven't, I've got a video series here, which I launched in January of 2021, just going through how to do that in 4 different parts. So I'm going to skip over that and just get installing the site, and let's generate a feed for the podcast, which is essentially the main difference between a standard website and a podcast site is that you provide a feed to give to a podcast aggregator like Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or what have you. So without further ado, let's install a site. I'm going to change directory to my sites folder. So cd sites, Statamic, new, and let's just call it podcast. So the site name is going to be called podcast, and we'll start with 0, just like a blank Statamic site. And when that's done, we're going to go PHP please make user could not open input file, and that's because we haven't gone into the directory of the site yet. So cd, then let's go to the site. Let's try again, shall we? Name J, yes. Okay, if I go back to the sites directory, I'm just going to secure that. Valet secure podcast. So my address now is podcast.wip, that's the TLD I'm using locally. Let's go to the control panel. So the first thing we're going to do is make a collection. So let's create collection and let's call it episodes. So like the podcast episodes. And then let's create entry. Let's call this Hello World. Cliche, I know. Save and publish. And then once we're in the main collection, I'm going to edit the blueprint just because we're going to want maybe an image in here. So I'm going to go assets, restrict this to 1, go back to our Hello World. And I'm just going to drop a random piece of artwork in here, save and publish. And let's just do a second one just so we can see the RSS feed working. By world, bit sad. Another random piece of artwork, save and publish that. So we've got 2 posts now. So the homepage is still just blank. So I'm going to open this up in my code editor. Go to home.antlers, which is what this is rendering here. And of course this is like an SVG. So I'm just going to say hello just to get this working. Okay, that's cool. So now if we go to the written part of the article, we're going to go to step 1 now, which is to output a link to a podcast RSS feed in your head. So I'm going to copy that. So all pages by default are rendered using layout.antlers. So if I go to layout antlers and I can see the head is here. So let's just paste this in. Name of your podcast feed. So I'm just going to call this J's feed, J's podcast feed. And then this is going to point to the current URL /RSS. Okay. So now this should look the same because I've just changed the head. And let's create an RSS template. So I'm going to create a file under views called rss.antlers.html. So actually home is in that correct folder. I can see resources view. So I'm just going to duplicate this, duplicate, and call it rss.antlers.html. And now I'm going to paste this example in here. So here what I've done is I've used some global settings from Statamic called brand. So let's just create these now, mostly because we can pass the CData modifier into this, which just tidies up the template a little bit. Podcast RSS feeds need almost everything in this CData tag. If I search the Statamic 3 documentation for CData, you can see this is a modifier. So CData is like an XML thing. I don't actually know what it means. Let's have a look. Character data. So let's create this global called brand. So if I go back to my control panel, go to globals, create global set, and let's call this brand. Okay, edit the blueprint. So let's create some fields here. So the first one I've got is name. So let's pick a text here. Let's call this name. So the handle is name. What else have we got? Authors. Let's create a new one again, text, authors, podcast description. Actually, let's do a text area for that. Create field, text area, podcast description. And you can see it transforms the handle to use an underscore, which is what we've got here. Podcast subtitle. So these things are recommended by Apple Podcasts. This seems to be the canonical thing to go to is to look at what Apple Podcasts does, since most other podcast aggregators follow this and they use the same tags. So in Apple Podcasts, it says that the subtitle should be a concise one-sentence description of your podcast. So what I'm going to do is, for convenience, I'm going to paste this as an instruction. Okay, and then, oh, sorry, I put this in the wrong one. Let's put this as a text since it's a one-sentence thing. Podcast subtitle, finish. Podcast owner. Sorry, this is a bit long, but I did say I would do it from scratch, so that's what I'm doing. Podcast email, text. So in this case, we can use the email input type to validate that. And then the rest, I've sort of put in manually by here. I didn't think it was worth making these dynamic. And I think that's it for the brand global set. So I've saved that. I've gone back. And now we can fill these things. So I'm just going to call this Jay's Podcast. Okay, save that. And what I would do then is anything that's not dynamic in here, which is pretty much just, there's the keywords tag, and there's also podcast categories. So I've put this in the article as well. iTunes have their own categories. So here are a list of the different types you can choose. You can choose up to 3, I believe. And apparently you should choose as many as you can because it just improves the discoverability of your podcast. And that should be set up. So what's the next step? Okay, and above we'll link it to an item partial, which looks like this. So where's the partial? Okay, RSS post. So let's again duplicate this file and call it RSS post, and the RSS post will be this. So let's replace the contents with this, and there's a few other fields we need to fill in here. So episode number, and then the artwork, and then the duration. So let's go back to our blueprint. So we go collections, episodes, and then up here, edit blueprints, episodes, episode number. So I'm going to put this as an integer. Finish that. I'm just going to put this at the top. So what I've got going on here is I've said if artwork is available. So I've called assets. I've actually called this artwork. Let's do that. If that's available, use that, and I've used glide to output these dimensions, square dimension. If it's not available, so I've not set it, then fall back to the general podcast artwork. So that's something worth talking about, is that most podcast aggregators, including Apple Podcasts, they actually only let you use a single piece of artwork. So as an example, if I go to this podcast, which I co-host, you'll see on every episode, the artwork is always this artwork here. It's always the same. But on Spotify, they actually let you use different artwork for every episode. So if you go down here, you'll see the different artwork for different episodes. So it's worth bearing that in mind that some let you do this. I think it's Spotify and maybe Radio Public let you do it as well. So that's why I've got an argument here saying that if there's individual artwork for the episode, then you can use that. You might want to make another blueprint entry called podcast artwork in the brand global, but I'm going to skip over that for now. And then the audio in the enclosure URL, we need that. So this is going to link to an external service where we're going to host our podcast. This is something worth discussing as well, is that when I was researching, I found out that typically if you have any kind of traffic amount to your site, what you're doing is if you're hosting the audio yourself, then your host will probably not like that because it uses up resources on the server. Most hosts sort of have what's called like a limited compute time, and every second that you're streaming something is a compute time. So most people will host on a podcast hosting site. I use something called Simplecast. There's also Transistor FM. I think that's also very good. This also gives you access to things like analytics It's got tools to create like snippets of the show, which is useful for social media. And this is effectively a content delivery network, or CDN, but you can still serve the feed from your own site. So what this is effectively, this audio, is a text field which we'll put a URL into. The other things you need to do is tell iTunes the size of the file in bytes and also the duration, so how long it is in seconds. So let's add those as well here. Let's say audio, e.g. simplecast URL, and this should be a URL, finish. So that's audio and size, and this should be in bytes, and duration. So this should be in this format. Okay, let's save that. Let's go back into the episode, just fill that information in. Hello world. So I'm just going to put in any old stuff here. So let's say this is 36 minutes. I'm just going to paste a dummy one in. Simplecast URLs look something like this. So you can see CDN, simplecast.com. So I'm going to save and publish again. So I think we can go to step 3 now, which is create a route. And as I've said here, what this does is it effectively removes the templating part of Statamic, and it just forces it to render it as XML. So what we're going to do is we're going to open web.php, which is in routes. And we've got an example here. So what we're going to do is just paste this in. So what this is saying is if we land on a URL that ends in /RSS, the next argument is which view to pass it. So we're going to push it to the RSS antlers file that we've got here. So views RSS antlers. And then we're saying don't use any kind of layout rendering, because by default it will pass it through this layout antlers. So we're saying skip that. And then we're saying to render it as XML, which is what's needed for the RSS podcast feed. So now that's in place, if I now go to podcast.wip/RSS, let's do that. So now you can see it's successfully rendered it as XML, and we can start to see everything that's output. So if I zoom in, you can see the C data is being output correctly. And luckily we've got these sort of enclosures that we can collapse. This is all dynamic, and we've got the actual items here. So each item would represent a podcast episode. So we've got Hello World as an item there, and then we've got Goodbye World as an item here. So what you do now is the final thing. You would validate your podcast feed. So I like these two. So I've opened up one of these, cast feed validator. So at this point, it's going to need to be live. And the other one is Podbase. And it's the same kind of thing, but it doesn't hurt you to run it through both of these just to make sure everything's okay. So it's quite possible in this video I might have made a mistake and maybe it won't render perfectly, but you can sort of troubleshoot the errors and fix anything minor yourself. If I find anything, I'll correct the written part of the article. But just to show you an example, so if I go to I don't have time to game anymore.com, so this is the podcast that I co-host, and then /RSS, because this particular site is exactly the same as what we've just done. I've built it on Statamic and it's using the same route and everything. So if I start the validation for this, you can get an example of what it'll look like. And pretty much everything's a tick. I've got one warning here because I moved the RSS feed. And here I've got everything as a tick, except I've got a warning on this, but I'm not sure exactly why, but I can tell you now it's fine. But these tests are quite thorough. I wouldn't take it as gospel, but as long as you've got a general tick range here, then you should be good to go. Thanks for listening. This has been a bit of a long one, but if you've got a podcast, you can now do it in Statamic.